Good morning, and in fact, Merry Christmas, and welcome to another Monday Morning Pastor, where we look at something that we said in church yesterday to help us get through the week. And yesterday we talked about Santa Claus. We tried to reframe him from the 20th and 21st century images of him, provided mostly by the famous poem by Clement Clarke Moore, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," and the Coca-Cola Company, to his origins, which are found in the original title of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," which was called A Visit by Saint Nicholas. And by the way, Santa Claus is our modern day pronunciation of Saint Nicholas, whose Dutch name, which was spread to New York during colonization, was Saint Claus, kind of an abbreviation of Saint Nicholas, or in Dutch, it was pronounced Sinterklaas, Santa Claus. So we are going to go back to Saint Nicholas, a 4th century church leader, so that when we think of Santa Claus today, we are inspired by 3 noble virtues that Nicholas had that should be part of every believer's life. The first virtue is perseverance under trial. And though Nicholas, and by the way, his name is 2 parts, Nicholas. Nick, the Greek preface or root word Nick is the word for victory or champion. And by the way, the Nike company, Nike, they take their name from this Greek word, which means victory or champion. And the second part of his name, Laos, is the word for people. We get the word laity or lay leadership. So victory and people. The victor of the people, or the champion of the people, is what the name Nicholas means. And although Nicholas was born in Turkey to a fairly wealthy family, at least 2 terrible things happened to Nicholas, and he was raised as a devout believer, a devout Christian. First bad thing that happened to him is that both of his parents died in an epidemic, and he was left an orphan. The second terrible thing that happened to him was that he, like many Christians in those first 2 or 3 centuries, experienced terrible persecution, and he was exiled away from his country, put in prison under Emperor Diocletian. Emperor Diocletian is noted as one of the most evil emperors that the Roman Empire had. His claim to fame is that he crucified more Christians than any other emperor. And somehow Nicholas survived that and came back to Turkey. When he came back to Turkey, he still had embraced his faith and eventually became a bishop or a church leader there. Now, losing your parents, surviving severe and unspeakable persecution, perhaps even knowing of family and friends, or even witnessing crucifixions, clearly Nicholas was a champion. Nicholas was a perseverer. And so when things get difficult and challenging, we are still called and we are given the ability as Christians to persevere. And our verse on perseverance we're going to use today is from Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, where it says, "Therefore we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses," or examples. "So let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set out before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition," that's Jesus, "consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." So the first virtue that we find in Saint Nicholas was perseverance. The second virtue that's going to make more sense to us today is generosity. And Nicholas was well known, and I don't have time to count all the various stories, true or maybe legend about him, was that he was incredibly generous and in fact gave away all his wealth that he had inherited and as much as he could to people in need. His key virtue was generosity, and what would be more generous than us giving of our time and even perhaps when called to give up our lives. Our key verse is from 1 John, chapter 3, verse 16, which says this: "By this we know what love is, that he laid down his life for us," that Jesus died for us, gave his life for us, and then we ought to lay down our lives or give our lives for our brothers. Generosity of time and even of life is a key virtue of being a believer, and a key example that we find in St. Nicholas. And finally, the third final virtue that we're going to focus on today is the virtue of justice and protecting the vulnerable and the weak. My favorite story about St. Nicholas is that he heard of these 3 daughters whose father could not afford a dowry for his 3 girls. And when you didn't have a dowry, you couldn't get married. And if you couldn't get married back in those days, sadly, you were very often destined to slavery or prostitution. This Bishop Nicholas, heard about this, and on 3 separate occasions gave 3 bags of gold to the father to take care of the girls' dowry, and so spared these women of a terrible future. The legend goes in different ways, but one version of the story is that the gold was tossed into a chimney, or the gold was tossed through a window and landed in stockings, and that gives us sort of our historical basis of our stockings and the fireplace and the chimney waiting for gifts. So Nicholas cared about the weak, cared about the vulnerable, and so should we. And our key verse for this is from the book of James, chapter 1, verse 27, that says this: "Religion that God our Father accepts." We should stop right there. What is the kind of religion that God wants? Well, he goes on and describes it to us in these following words. Religion that God our Father accepts is pure and faultless, and it is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So when you think of Santa Claus, Cinder Claus, St. Nicholas, think of these 3 virtues: perseverance, generosity, and protecting the weak and the vulnerable. Thank you for watching. Have a great week, and we hope to see you Sunday.